Hello everyone. So this video is to mark the death of Abdulaziz Bouteflika. Forgive me if I mispronounce that, the quondam president of Algeria. So his passing is significant because he's the last surviving African ruler who fought in the anti-colonial struggle in the 1950s and 60s. So he's died at the age of 84. And he wasn't a sitting president when he died. He resigned in 2019 because he was in failing health. He hadn't been seen in public since 2017, which gives you an idea of just how infirm he was. So it was a gerontocracy for some time before that. He was a very short man, not that is very significant, but I'm told that actually people who are rather lacking in stature tend to have slightly poorer health outcomes. So it's surprising he managed to make it to 84 in a country where the life expectancy is well below that. He was a dictator, and there were these sort of charade elections. A fairly brutal dictator, it's fair to say. I mean, there can be such things as benign dictators. So he was born in 1937 in what was then French Algeria. And the French citizens, who were no more than 20% of the population, they had effective control, and they were represented in the French National Assembly in Paris. And the law stated that Algeria was a part of the domestic French state that was not a colony. But 80% of Algerians, overwhelmingly Arabic speakers and Berbers, were not French citizens. They were subjects of France, if you follow, but not citizens. So the French people who'd gone out from France to settle there, they were French citizens, they retained their rights. Remember, France had invaded Algeria in 1830, when the Dey of Algiers, as a ruler of Algiers, had, in a fit of pique, lashed the French ambassador across the face with a fly whisk. And so this was Paris's response. Indeed, the French Foreign Legion was founded partly for the conquest of Algeria, and La Légion remained battling there really throughout the whole history of French Algeria. And so the French citizens took over the choicest lands there, because some of the Mediterranean coast is fairly fertile. So it was sort of France's fourth shore, if you will. And a lot of French citizens in Algeria were not ethnically French. They were Italians, Spaniards, Maltese, even Germans who become naturalized French citizens. But the indigenous Algerians, they generally speaking didn't get French citizenship. They could obtain it by being fluent in French, being of good character, and performing French military service. Very few of them attained it. Now, you could join the French army in special Algerian units, even if you weren't a French citizen, and that didn't confer French citizenship on you, no matter how gallantly you fought. Because remember, in the 19th century, very few Algerians were literate in any language. There was mass illiteracy everywhere. Even in France, quite a few people were illiterate in the 19th century. A lot of Frenchmen didn't actually speak French in the 19th century, could only speak their regional language, Breton, Luxembourgish, Flemish, Occitan, Provençal, Niçois, Dauphiné, Basque, Catalan, Valaisois, perhaps a few that I'm missing. Anyway, the Jewish community in Algeria have been there since time immemorial. Well, since the destruction of the Temple of Solomon by the Romans. They were made French citizens en bloc by the French government in the late 19th century. Obviously, the great majority of Algerians are Muslims. So Muslims could become French citizens, but it's unusual, especially after 1904, when France became a secular country. But by the 1950s, many Algerians decided the situation was unacceptable. They formed La Front de Libération Nationale, that's the National Liberation Front, FLN, and they began rebelling against French rule, ultimately successful. There'd been a massacre of French civilians by Algerian ultranationalists right after the Second World War, 100 of them, and then some Frenchmen struck back and killed 10,000 Algerian civilians in one day. Now, obviously, it's terrible to kill civilians deliberately. 100 French people killed, monstrous, but killing 100 times more is 100 times worse. And I don't think anyone was punished for that. So we don't hear very much about that. Anyway, Bouteflika, he studied the Quran a lot. He went abroad. He was in Morocco, training to be in the FLN, fighting in the southern part of Algeria in the desert. Almost nobody lived there. There were a few major cities on the coast where the French community mostly lived. Albert Camus lived there, for example. And the thing is, the French people were sometimes in a majority in those coastal cities and might not even realise that actually overall in Algeria they were in a minority. And until the 50s, Algeria was a popular holiday destination. Oscar Wilde had been in there on holiday in the late 19th century. Anyway, Algeria became independent in 1962, but the jubilance many Algerians felt was short-lived. It soon became a military dictatorship. It was aligned to the Eastern Bloc in the Cold War. There wasn't actually a communist country. It was ruled sort of by a sort of secular military dictatorship, because those who'd like to turn it into an Islamic caliphate, that never happened. And there was an immense frustration amongst the population by the early 90s because of economic stagnation, because of defalcation on behalf of the military dictatorship and a lack of freedom of expression and so on. The oil and gas money going to a minute elite is a familiar story of banana republicanism, benzene republicanism, I christened it. Anyway, and also any assistance they got from the Soviet Union was over. The Soviet Union had ended. So finally, there was huge demonstrations which forced the military dictatorship to hold an election, and they were facing the FIS, the Islamic Salvation Front, a party who accepted a fair election but once. And once they were in office, they never held one again to make it an Islamic state, because although over 99% of Algerians are Muslims, it was a secular state. You could eat what you want, drink what you want, wear what you want. There might be certain social pressure to abide by certain laws, but it wasn't by the law of the land. Now, obviously, the FIS didn't want that. They wanted to be ruled by the basis of the Quran, as in bring back polygamy, outlaw pork, alcohol, all sorts of films, books, maybe music, dancing, things like that. So there was a huge rebellion, but the FIS had their charitable work, and they won over the frustrated masses of impoverished people. And it was because the army, they annulled the result of the election when the FIS won. And there was horrific fighting for several years. Tens of thousands of people were killed. A lot of civilians were deliberately killed, both by the GIS, Groupe Islamique Armée, GIA, sorry. That's the armed wing of the FIS, and by the military dictatorship. So by a curious irony, it was the military dictatorship which were more liberal than the others. And France, the former colonial master, they backed the military dictatorship. And so the GIA, they set off bombs in the Parisian metro to hit back at France, because obviously France has got a large Algerian community, many of them naturalized French citizens. But and after 9/11, George W. Bush saw this as part of the war on terror, and he extended all sorts of military aid and intelligence cooperation to the military dictatorship. Being though they were completely undemocratic, they were certainly against Islamism, despite being almost all Muslims themselves. So Bouteflika was a practicing Muslim. That was allowed, obviously. He's clean-shaven, and notice how hirsute you are as a sign of piety in the Islamic world. Yeah, he's passed away. I think he won't be missed. He ruled since 1999, managed to steady the ship of state, but did very little for ordinary Algerians, many of whom want to get out of the country. So he shall not be missed, but no doubt he will get lots of respectful obituaries, and I shan't be composing an elegy to him myself. Toodaloo.